Today is August 13th, 2019, and this is Kate Stalker here with Pete Gunderson from Gunderson Funeral Homes. Thanks for coming, Pete. Can you tell us why you wanted to share your story?
So, I hear it so often from families that we work with that, they can't remember accurately about some of the stories they've heard from their relatives, whether it's aunts, uncles, cousins, moms and dads, grandmas, grandpas. And, so hearing it from the horse's mouth, I guess, isn't a bad idea.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. So I know that you are third generation in your family business, but were you born in Monona?
So I was born St. Mary's Hospital, Madison, of course, but grew up in town of Blooming Grove, actually, about a half a block out of Monona. The village had not grown into the township at that point, but as you might have heard around the area, we're all Grovers. So it's all Monona Grove, Blooming Grove, Cottage Grove.
Yes. So tell me about your parents and grandparents. What memories do you have?
Sure. My grandfather passed away when my dad was 14, so long before. And so it was all more hearsay or stories that we might hear. But my grandmother lived well into her 80s and was certainly part of our years growing up and participated in shaping our lives too. Along the way. She was also part of the business and always around helping out with things there too.
Mm-hmm. So your grandfather started that business, correct? And then your father must have had to take over fairly young then.
Yeah, so Grandpa was in World War I, and he served as a medic in World War I in the Army. And in those days, the medics also handled graves registration for those on the battlefield that didn't make it back on their own. And so that's where he got some of his first exposure to the to some of the skill sets that he needed there. He died in 1940, though, after starting his own funeral home in 1922 on Madison's east side on Shanks Corners. So not far from the village of Monona's border. Mm-hmm. And at that time, Grandma Inez, that was Elmer, Grandma Inez, with 7 children, 5 girls and 2 boys, decided she's going to get her license, undertaker's license. And
wow, really?
Yeah. So in those days, it was a 9-week school. She got help with the kids and went off to her 9 weeks, came back. She had the help of a retiring funeral director while she was away to run the business, and came back and took it from there. And
that's fascinating. She was ahead of her time, wasn't she?
She was, and she was a determined Norwegian gal that just decided that she had to figure out how to keep these 7 kids fed, and the east side was a very strong Norwegian community, though, too, at the same time. Different sectors of the city on the east side were also Irish and certainly German and others, but the communities stuck together pretty good, and being the Norwegian undertaker on the east side, and in the Monona area and the region out DeForest is where they had both grown up, and so had long-time ties on the east end of the county here too.
Wow. And what made you decide that was something you wanted to go into?
You grow up helping around the business. We did not live right in the buildings themselves like some did. But you were sweeping the parking lots, you were mowing the lawns, you were putting chairs up, you were taking chairs down. You were called out in the middle of the night out of bed when Dad was called out to go with them and use your muscles to help move somebody from wherever the death might occur, whether that was in a formal institution or a hospital, which would be a hospital or a care center or wherever it might be, or whether it was a train accident or a drowning or whatever it might be there too. So you had some exposure and you had some understanding of the trust that people had in you to help them through these times. My dad, at 14, had been helping his dad for several years already. His younger brother Chuck was helping out also. He went on to be a Lutheran pastor, and still in a caregiving setting, profession. But my dad, Bob, went off to the Navy as soon as high school. He was out of high school at East High. As soon as he was out of the Navy, he went on to mortuary school in Milwaukee. It was back in 1948 and 9. He joined the company and all. But that leads you through the years there. But growing up in the experience, I guess, where most other kids wouldn't have had that exposure.
Right.
To it wasn't necessarily a dinner table conversation.
Right, I would imagine that you had a much different view of death than other people do, right from an early age.
Yeah.
Do you ever remember being afraid, or did you grow into it, or was it always just so normal?
I think your acceptance of death as part of everyday life. We probably learned that early, and we didn't know any more than anybody else on what's going to be the afterlife like or anything like that. But we did know that it is part of life just as much as a new baby in the house is. This is unfortunately it's part of what happens too, and it's at the same time though, I'd say if I was walking by a cemetery and on the road or walking through a cemetery, I'm probably looking over my shoulder and I'm probably whistling and I'm going, there's something spiritual here and I'm not quite sure what it is, but
interesting. Has it made it any easier for you when you've lost your loved ones to know the process, or do you think it's just the same as it is for everyone else?
I think there's really two parts to that. I think certainly it's not just the same. It is. It's much more personal. When it's in your house, it's all about those relationships and the ties that go with that. And I'll often use an example of I was in Boy Scouts, so we learned to tie knots, and we learned to tie various knots, and each one of those knots was individual and used for a certain purpose. But when you come to trying to untie those knots, some of them are hard to untie and some of them aren't as hard to untie and come apart early, a little bit easier on you. And I think that's the same way with your relationships, whether it's in your own individual family or whether it's with some of your best friends or colleagues. Some of those knots are harder to untie and some of them are a little easier to untie. So, all of the emotions are there. And then on the other side, though, the other half of your brain says, well, here's how we work through some of those things. And, there's some process. There has to be some meaningful activities. There needs to be things that reflect on how you believe, how your beliefs have developed, whether that's faith-based or whether that's biological based, whether that's whatever it is, and walking through that process is very important. But it's also interesting for me to watch when my my parents passed away and where my in-laws passed away, my kids were so comfortable approaching a casket. But they'd also helped me lift caskets in and out of cars for years, even if they were only 7 years old, you know. They've also seen them in our buildings there. And so again, I think some of that comes back to exposure.
Sure.
Early on. You know, I can walk through a cemetery and just the history intrigues me because, you know, I could see when the flu epidemic was in the early 1900s.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah.
And I can see the World War II or the World War I or the Vietnam era. Especially if a cemetery is set up where it's progressively moves down a roadway. And those are all things that you can pick out of that.
Yeah, I would imagine your business has been in place through several epidemics. Can you talk about some of that?
You know what, we have, and you know, some of it's by legends, stories, those kinds of things. Certainly the flu epidemic back in the 1917s, 18s, 19s, whatever those years were, with children, the expectations of families. You could see 2-3 children in a family that maybe weren't months apart on that, you know. But you'd also see during the polio years, during the, you know, other things might be not as pronounced possibly, but early years of the AIDS epidemics here. But then certainly the artificial epidemics, which might be wars, they might be things that happened in a small region that were unexpected along the way.
Yes, yes, and I imagine you've seen a lot of those, and unfortunately you'll see a lot more.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about wars. I know you're a little too young for Vietnam, but I imagine you had some casualties from that era, from that war. Do you have any stories to tell us about that time?
Yeah, you know, and that's those are so memorable in that they hit typically a young demographic, and unfortunately, and you know, I graduated La Follette High School. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go to Monona Grove. The city of Madison annexed us a few years before that, but you know, it's right across the golf course from Monona Grove and all. But in '75, I graduated. But prior to that, you know, growing up in the household I can remember a phone call coming in from family down the street from us whose son was in Vietnam on the front lines and had been killed in action. And that leaves a pretty big impression on you. As you know, just 2 years before, you'd seen this kid on the football team in high school. You'd seen
and I imagine you had your draft number by then.
I had my draft numbers by then, and fortunately for me, they weren't pulling them any longer. You were still, you know, you were still assigned your draft number by birthday, but I didn't have that experience, and that's pretty okay.
Wow.
I feel fortunate with that.
Yes.
So, and not only in Vietnam, but you know, you got into Desert Storm, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars recently, and we've had neighborhood casualties there also. You know, and it's can leave you with a big heartache, and you do wonder why we're there. You know, there's all kinds of viewpoints on that, but it's where it is.
You're seeing the hardest end of it. I imagine you have military at some of these wakes, and does that happen at the funeral home or does that happen at the cemetery?
Sure. You know, it depends on where the ceremonies are going to be held and more meaningful. If we are going to a cemetery, most of the time those honors would be presented at a cemetery at the final prayers and final goodbyes. The active military participates in those some of the time. We'll have Navy out of Illinois come up. We'll have Air Force out of Scott Air Force Base and the St. Louis area come up. We'll have the Marine Corps up from Camp Lejeune. We'll have whoever it is at the moment. Coast Guard comes in, whoever it might be. But we also have honors presented by local VSOs, they'll call them. So they're veteran service organizations, and so your American Legions, your VFWs, your disabled American veterans, your all of those groups participate most of the time. When there's an active military action going on around the world, more often we'll have the veterans groups in because the others aren't as available, or we'll have one or two officers from the Navy show up along, and then we'll complement them with the BFW or the American Legion post. So you have rifle teams, you have buglers, you'll have often a chaplain, and but they're there. I think the image that comes from that is those of us that haven't been there. The honors and the respect that's presented that day, and especially for younger kids too. They're seeing the news. We're seeing the news, and we see all of these, all the activities going on that we aren't comfortable with, but to have the camaraderie of a unit, a military unit, in that respectful role leaves a whole different impression on each of us.
Yes, having been there, I can appreciate how moving it is to see that. So, shifting gears a little bit, you've been in Monona for many, many years, but you have funeral homes all over the area here. Do you see a difference in the demographics or the culture or the customs between suburbs of Madison, or are people generally the same?
Sure. You will. Madison's melting pot today is very different from what it was when I started in the 1970s. And the 1970s was very different than when my grandparents and my dad were in the early 1900s. I'm sure. We have new melting pots. I may look at it and say, we were still in the 70s and 80s looking at the Irish and Italian and Norwegians and whoever else it might have been, German backgrounds. There were, all of the not only religious backgrounds, but what are our customs, or how do we do things, and so there was always a little twist to everything. The 80s and the 90s brought in more of the Far Eastern cultures into the Madison area and the Dane County area. We've got state and federal government in town. We've got a strong medical contingency here. We've got the universities, the colleges here, and so they bring all of the smarts come to Madison. So, which is really good.
We like to think so.
Yeah. So, which is really good because along with it, they bring their life experiences. And so when it comes to celebrating a life, honoring a life, and recognizing a life lived well, that might mean different things to different people.